Alright guys, so we all know about Floyd Rose string tension, but what about spring tension? You've probably asked yourself, how many springs should I actually use? How tight do they need to be for my guitar specific tuning? Good thing for you, I've solved this guitar conundrum and we'll get your floating trem up and running in no time. And make sure you stick around to the end for a little insight on if angled springs are right for your setup. This is the axe, let's go! Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. For those of you that are new, my name is Nick. The balancing act of a Floyd Rose or a floating trem can really be a pain in the ass. But once you figured it all out, it becomes second nature. It's one thing to pick out the strings and tuning that you want, but then it's another to figure out how many springs and what orientation of those springs to provide the counter tension in the back rear cavity. As a quick recap, the strings are attached to the Floyd Rose or floating trem on top of the guitar, providing tension this way, and the springs in the back counter or really equal the tension of the strings to allow the Floyd Rose to float and to move freely. And if you want to make small adjustments to your spring tension, it can be done with these two screws here. Now the amount of springs and their orientation can give you a couple things. One, the proper counter tension to the string tension, and two, determine the rigidness of the actual floating trem and determine how kind of resistant your whammy bar is. So here's an example of two of my guitars. Here I have a guitar that's tuned in D standard with a set of 11 to 50 strings. Turn this around and take a look at the rear cavity, and I have 3 springs, 2 of which are angled, that are providing the counterbalance to that string tension. Now, if I don't like the way the whammy bar feels or it's not enough stability or tension, I can add another string in this back cavity to make that a little bit more responsive. This increases spring tension and the resistance of the whammy bar when I press on it. This is very important if you do whammy bar flutters and need an articulate, more responsive floating trem. Now, something to note, if you add another spring in the back, you're gonna have to let up on the 2 spring tension screws in the back cavity to match the string tension. Keep in mind, there's different springs out there which actually come in different strengths. Companies like FU-Tone have an array of different colors and strengths that allow you to really dial in that counter tension through the springs. Now that's a conversation for a whole nother video and a whole nother time, honestly. Now, when should you use angled springs versus a straight spring setup? Let's first dive into what angle springs actually do. When you angle a spring, you're essentially lengthening it, and when you lengthen it, you add more tension. Think about when you pull a pinball plunger back and release it. The further you pull it back, the farther the pinball will go. And now I'm realizing just how old I am. Now, angling a spring does indeed increase spring tension, but not to the degree as if you were to add a whole nother spring to your back cavity. Knowing this, angling those springs really allow you to make small adjustments in your spring tension rather than throwing on a whole nother spring and then having to make massive adjustments on your 2 spring tension screws. It's a really good way to make fine detailed adjustments for your floating trem stability and responsiveness. Anyways, are angled springs good for your setup? It all depends on the setup you're going for. What I can speak to and how I use angled springs is I use it to make my whammy bar a little bit more resistant when I'm using 3 springs. I use a lot of whammy bar in my playing, and I use the angled springs when I do like whammy flutters so I can get a concise, articulate flutter that doesn't kind of like continue well after the note. My advice for anybody looking to alter their spring tension is to really just play around with it. Know that different manufacturers and different setups require varying amounts of spring tension. Pick a string gauge and then a tuning you like, and then make small adjustments to the spring tension as needed. If you need any help whatsoever, please feel free to message me on Instagram at @NickAxeGuitar. Alright guys, that does it for this video. Smash the like button and as always, subscribe. With that said, I just want to thank each and every one of you for stopping by the channel. I really appreciate it, and I will see you later.